Welcome to another IAEI News Live. My name is Thomas Dimitrovich. Today we're going to talk about services. So we're going to be using the 1 and 2 family dwelling unit, dwelling electrical systems presentation from IAEI, and it is available online. So let's get started. Let's talk services. And it all starts now. Obviously, I'm traveling. So I'm in a hotel up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Steve Froming, I think if you're out there, hey buddy, where you at? So what I wanted to cover today is I wanted to cover services. It's from an electrical perspective, services plays an important role in bringing power and solution to a structure. There are a lot of little details when it comes to services that we need to think about, and we're going to cover as much as we can in about an hour. All right. So, all right. Disconnect. All right. So let's talk services. So this is an image of a service. You'll see how we have a weatherhead. We have the power comes down, in this case on the image on the right, to a meter socket, and then the meter socket goes to a panel board. And the same thing on the left here. We have these are two separate services, but very similar in construction. We'll talk a little bit about the weatherhead, how we connect the utility to the structure itself. There's various ways we get that done. We can have an overhead. We can have an underground. We're going to cover and talk a little bit about both of those. There's your service entrance equipment. You notice we have a main overcurrent protective device. We'll try to touch a little bit on the grounding and bonding in this service entrance equipment. There's a little details in there that we need to understand, especially some of the things that I've seen in the industry in various applications. Modifications are made to equipment. And we really have to understand the significance of some of the bonding and where you land the grounding electrode conductor and where you land the neutrals, your grounded conductors. All of those are very important details that if you get that wrong, depending upon how the bonding is done inside that service entrance equipment, that could be ungood. So follow manufacturer's instructions and understand the electrical code requirements. All right, so here's some general requirements for services. Basically, in 230.2, it says a building or other structure is generally required to be served by only one service. Now, there are special conditions, so keep that in mind, but it says generally required to be served by only one service. In 230.3, service conductors supplying a building or structure cannot pass through the interior of another building or structure. So I'll tell you where I've seen that from an application perspective, where you may have, like, say, a strip mall or multiple dwellings. How would you call it? Like apartments, where you might have a multifamily dwelling. You might have 3 in a row dwelling units, and the service might be on one side. And I've seen where the service conductors were routed, say, through an attic way or through from one structure to another structure to the last structure. And what 230.3 is telling us is that you cannot pass service conductors that supply a building or structure cannot pass through the interior of another building or structure. Now, you have to understand your building codes too, on what defines a structure or what defines the building. Conductors other than service conductors are not permitted in the same raceway or cable with the service conductors. So if I have a raceway, or it says cable. Remember, when we say cable, when we say cable, we are talking about one sheath around multiple conductors inside. And what 230.7 is telling us is that conductors other than service conductors are not permitted in that cable or the raceway. So if I have a raceway, a conduit, etc., and it has service entrance conductors, we treat service entrance conductors very special. Why? Because they're unprotected. So the method of providing a level of protection, minimizing risk associated with those conductors, we will treat them special. How we route them, 230.7, where we route them, 230.3. So we provide a level of protection for those conductors, and we have special requirements because, again, they're unprotected conductors. Service raceways entering buildings from an underground distribution system are required to be sealed with a material identified for the use. So remember, you have a raceway, you have conduit underground service that's feeding a structure that is considered a wet location. We don't want any types of external environment impact on the assembly that you're bringing that raceway into, whether it be a panel board, a disconnect switch, etc. So in 230.8, we're looking for some sort of material, sealing material, and we say it's designed for the use. You have to make sure you pick it appropriately. Look at the listing, look at the manufacturer's instructions, etc. Now, there's a defined term for premises wiring system. Now, remember, we're going to hit definitions, and it's really important that you understand the significance of terminology. Why do we spend time even talking about terminology? It's because once you identify and understand the way a term is used, for example, premises wiring systems, or what a service is, or what a service cable is, the moment we understand whatever it is we're looking at or applying, once we know that it is a service conductor, if we know it is a feeder, if we know it is a branch circuit, if we understand the way the terms are defined, then we know what parts of the National Electrical Code that we need to apply to that, whatever it is, right? So service equipment, if I'm installing a piece of equipment, if I'm installing a panel board, a switchboard, a switchgear, and I look at the application, I go back to the defined terms, and I say, well, boy, this is service equipment because it meets the definition of service equipment. I'm going to go to Article 230, and I'm going to apply the requirements in Article 230 for service equipment. If I want to determine the size of that equipment, I go to 220, but I'm sizing for a service. So there's a specific part in Article 220. But it all hinges on whether or not the equipment I'm looking at is service equipment. Okay? So now here we have a definition of premises wiring systems. Interior and exterior wiring, including power, lighting, control, and signal circuit wiring, together with all their associated hardware, fittings, and wiring devices, both permanently and temporarily installed. This includes A, wiring from the service point or power source to the outlets, or B, wiring from and including the power source to the outlets where there is no service point. So then we have to understand what is a service point too, right? So in each of the defined terms, you're going to find other terms. you have to make sure, and sometimes you have to be very detail oriented and understand how everything is being applied. All of these different terms are being applied, even in a term. So here we have the defined term of a premises wiring system, and it's using a service point, which is another defined term. If you don't know what the service point is or where it's at in your power distribution system, that's going to be a detail you need to determine to be able to properly apply the National Electrical Code. All right, we're going to cover what those terms are, but I want you to understand the significance and why it's important to understand terms and their definitions. Okay, now service. What is a service? The conductors and equipment connecting electric energy from the serving utility to the wiring system of the premises served. Now, what is that telling us? That's telling us that one of the important words in that definition is utility. It's not a piece of equipment that connects a generator. Generator is not a utility. It's not a piece of equipment that connects photovoltaics. Photovoltaics is not a utility. Your on-site generation, energy storage systems. Remember, the utility is the utility. It's going to be a separate entity who owns the equipment, and they're going to be bringing power to the structure. And they're going to be bringing that power via service cables. Service conductors made up in the form of a cable. So we know, now here's another one. They're using two terms. They're using a term in a term. In a service cable, you have service conductors, but you have to understand what a service conductor is. And a service conductor are the conductors from the service point to the service disconnecting means. There's two more terms, a service disconnecting means and the service point. Service conductors overhead, and then you have service conductors underground. I think it's kind of obvious what those are. So you already had the definition of a service conductor, and now we're talking about service conductors that are supplied overhead, and they give you the specifics around that in from a terminology perspective in Article 100, and also underground. Underground, the conductors between the service point, so you have to understand what the service point is again, and the first point of connection to the service entrance conductors in a terminal meter box, terminal box meter or other enclosure inside or outside of the building. Then you have your service drop. Now, what's the service drop? The overhead conductors. So we know we're going to have overhead conductors. It's not going to be an underground feed. It's going to be overhead conductors. So it's between the serving utility and the service point. But we're going to have to remember, we have to determine what the service point is. The service entrance conductor, the service entrance conductor's overhead system. Service conductors between the terminals of the service equipment and the point, usually outside the building. Clear of building walls where joined by tap or splice, etc. Okay, so we're basically walking through your service equipment from the utility down to the connecting of the structure, and we're understanding each of the parts and pieces of that system. All right, so you have your service entrance conductors underground system, and then you have your service equipment. Let's take a look at service equipment. The necessary equipment, usually consisting of a circuit breaker or switches and fuses and their accessories, connected to the serving utility and intended to constitute the main control and disconnect of the serving utility. Now, we've had debates and discussions, say in Article 705. When you have a set of conductors that's coming from the utility, it's connecting the utility, the serving utility, to, say, a PV disconnect. The debate that has been had in the past is that those conductors are not service conductors. But based upon this definition of what service equipment is, that PV disconnect, which may be a PV disconnect, is also a service disconnect. So that tells us a couple other things. That you can have one piece of equipment that meets multiple definitions. And that means you'll have requirements in various areas of the National Electrical Code that you need to think about. All right, service equipment. So it's important to understand what service equipment is. And you have your service lateral, the underground conductors between the utility electric supply system and the service point. So these are underground conductors. When you talk about a service lateral, that's an underground conductor. I can't be looking at an overhead conductor and call it a service lateral. And then you have your service point. Finally, we've used the term service point multiple times in the beginning of this discussion of services. So a service point is the point of connection between the facilities of the serving utility and the premises wiring. This is that point of line of demarcation is your service point. In some cases, your service point might be up on a pole. In some cases, your service point might be in a meter. You've got to just understand, based upon the serving utilities rules and regulations, what the service point is. Okay? And there's an informational note for service point. The service point can be described as the point of demarcation, that line of demarcation between where the serving utility ends and the premises wiring begins. The serving utility generally specifies the location of the service point based on the conditions of service. So if you think about it, like when you go to a lot of our IAEI meetings, I know in the West Virginia chapter, we've done this in the past. We've had the utility come to our meetings. They've provided the rules. They've provided the books that help our electricians understand details, especially around service equipment. Because we have to understand where the utility stops and your ownership begins. And the significance of that is that the National Electrical Code applies to what you own, not what is under the purview of the utility. So any equipment, any distribution that is owned by the utility is going to be ruled and governed by the National Electrical Safety Code. That line of demarcation is a very important piece of information that you need to understand and be able to identify on every single structure that you are working on. Very important. So this is a good image. I like this image here. This is really shows both an underground and an overhead discussion. Remember how we said service laterals. Service laterals are underground. Service drops are overhead. Okay, so you see the two terms and how they're used based upon the application. Then you have your service entrance conductors overhead, and you have underground service conductors, and both of those supply service equipment. So this would be your service equipment, and this would be your service equipment. So here's an example. So that's your meter socket. So now in this case here, this is an underground service. So you have an underground service. So you have a service lateral coming from a transformer going to the service point. And that's the meter. So this is your service point. Okay. There is your point of attachment for your service point. The service point, this is an overhead service coming in to this structure, and the service point is right there above the weatherhead. Now, we also have to understand, remember how I told you earlier that when we're dealing with service conductors, we treat them special. We have to understand that those are unprotected conductors. So we will protect them physically, provide physical protection. And a part of the physical protection outside of any raceway, etc., is the distance and clearances when we're going over a structure, even over a swimming pool. There's a lot of different types of things you need to understand with regard to distances from these conductors. So the code requires minimum clearances for service conductors installed as open conductors. porches, balconies, ladders, stairs. It doesn't restrict the installation of multi-conductor cable assemblies that has an overall outer jacket, such as type SE. And the reference that we're giving you there is section 230.9. All right, so open service conductors got 3 foot installed by any. So open service conductors, including the drip loop, cannot be installed any closer than 3 feet from the sides of bottom of any window that is designed to be opened. Now, there are windows that might not have that ability to be opened at all. They're just a window, period. So it's important to understand, even if you're in the structure, if you're in the design phase and the windows aren't in yet, you need to understand what is going to be placed where. And then the 3 foot clearance is required from doors, porches, balconies, ladders, stairs, fire escapes, and any other similar locations. That 3 foot clearance is intended to keep open service conductors at least outside of reach distance. So any of these openings, what you're trying to avoid is somebody accidentally touching these open conductors. Okay, so remember, ways I can eliminate shock. I can provide distance as one of them. I can put barriers around something, or I can provide distance so you can't touch it. In this case here, we're working on the distance angle. So service conductors installed above the top level of a window. You're not required to maintain that 3 foot. If you have your service conductors in the form of service entrance cables, type of SE or SER, and then your service conductors installed in a raceway. So remember, if I'm I'm either going to give you that distance so you can't reach and touch it, or I'm going to physically provide a barrier. So there's a good example where I have a balcony, I have a door. What you don't want is someone to be able to stand on the edge of that balcony, reach out and touch a conductor. So I'm going to provide that. And then you have a window. So you've got to think physically, where are you going to serve that structure with the conductors that are serving that structure from the utility? You got to think about all the little details. General rules for clearances require service drops to have a minimum vertical clearance of not less than 8 feet where they pass over a roof. And then it's generally to be maintained for a distance of about not 3 feet in all directions from the edge of the roof. There are 5 exceptions. Take a look at NEC 230.24 A and B. So this is a good image of what we're talking about here. You've got, in some cases, you may have come across the top of the structure and feed that structure from the other side. Now remember, whenever you're dealing with in a construction environment, there's no set rule for every single structure, right? Every application most applications are going to be different. So you've got to really think about, where is your serving utility? How are you going to get the conductors there? Where are they going to be routed? And understand, if you're going over the roof, how are you going to get it done? Maintaining all of your distances. You remember, you're worried about reach at that point. There's a good example. Now you could say, why wouldn't they serve it a different way? Well, that's probably where the utility was available. Remember, sometimes you can't, well, in most cases, you're not going to move where the utility lines are. You got to look at where your structure is, look at where your utility lines are, and figure out how you're going to get those conductors there, following the rules, reach, etc. Then you have your supports. Now you may have to support those conductors if from a sag perspective, based upon the distance between point A and B, you may not be able to pull it really tight. So you might have to provide a post in the interim, and those requirements are found in 230.29 when you have supports over buildings. And remember, when you do that, you've got to pay attention to your grounding and bonding. So don't forget about section 250.102 Charlie 1 for the details on grounding and bonding of that for your bonding jumpers for that equipment. What you want to avoid is energizing something and not having good fault return paths, etc. I'm sure somebody out there in grounding and bonding is going to nitpick the words I used there. But that's okay. That's what it's all about. All right, 8 foot above the roof, reduction, with exceptions, reduction of the service drop clearances to 3 foot are permitted when the voltage between the service drop conductors is not over 300 volts and the roof has a slope of 4 inches, of 4 inches in 12-inch or greater. So what they're doing there is they're basically looking at the slope of the roof that you're going over, and I would assume it's probably because of understanding who could possibly be standing. If you have a flat roof, you have a higher likelihood of somebody standing on a roof. If it's a very steep roof, it's something that is going to be planned, and you're going to be looking at all your hazards, etc. So they permit you to reduce that 8 foot distance in that example. Now here's some more reductions. Voltage between conductors does not exceed 300 volts. Service drop passes over only the overhanging portion of the roof and not more than 6 foot. So I'm not going to go through each of these. Remember, just check these sections out for the exceptions. My point right here is that you need to think about when you're bringing these service conductors over a structure, you need to have the proper clearances. Okay, this PowerPoint slide deck has great images like the one you're looking at right now, where we have nice, clear, to provide the understanding of your clearances and distances and things of that nature. All right, let's just keep moving. There's again vertical clearances from final grade. 230.28, your service mast as support. There's details from a support perspective. Again, you've got to think about when you are bringing these conductors in, not only about the clearances, but then how are you going to support those conductors? Remember, if you're going from point A to point B, you're going to be securing those conductors. You don't want to rely on the conductor itself. It's not like you bring the conductor over and wrap black tape around it and think, okay, call it a day. You need to pay attention to how you are securing those conductors. We don't want them falling during windstorms, etc. So they have to be secured in place. Those details are in 230.28. I think it's important to understand some of the reasons why. If you look at a section and you're reading the language, putting it into perspective of understanding the why helps you understand some of the language. And there's when you're burying, direct burial, etc. These conductors, they have depth restrictions, etc. So that when you have an underground service entrance conductors, again, we're worried about these are unprotected conductors. This is on the secondary of a transformer. It's an unprotected conductor that we're going to either protect via raceway or conduit. In this case, we're direct burying, so you got to be mindful of what are the depth requirements, etc. Now, so your service entrance cables, your type USC, you have to understand the conductors that you're using. Those are important. What are you required to use? And then what are the restrictions and the requirements when you use certain types of cables? So that's what the type USE cable and what this article 338 will give you the details of USE cable and how to properly apply those conductors. Okay, so 338.12b2 and then also 230.41 when you're dealing with USE cable. And as a service lateral permitted to emerge above the ground outside a meter enclosure. So again, follow the rules. Remember, unprotected conductors, we're having to provide either distance or physical layer protection to make sure that we don't expose somebody unintentionally to a hazard. More on SE cable. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these details. Just be mindful that you have to understand what USE cable is and how to properly apply it. Here's a good picture of USE cable. Well, you have to understand whenever you're using this cable, what are the proper fittings? I mean, I know it applies to any piece of equipment that we install. We have to make sure that we have the right terminations and we use the right fittings and they're all listed to work together. It's important here on service entrance equipment as well. And I would say your awareness should be even heightened higher because of the fact these are unprotected conductors. Okay, so be very careful and you pay attention to the details, pay attention to every fitting, every termination when you're dealing with these service conductors. Not that doing that throughout the entire power distribution system is not important as well. I'm just saying these are unprotected conductors. We have to make sure there are special rules that apply to these conductors that may be different than anywhere else in your power distribution system. So that's what I mean by pay attention to the details. Understand, these are service entrance conductors, these are service conductors, and I need to treat them special. What kind of conductor am I using, etc. Now, I like this diagram. This is 230.43.7 service entrance cables. What I like about this, it shows the weatherhead. It shows you have the weatherhead. You have the type SE cable. You have your cable supports down through this as we supply the meter. You've got a weatherproof gland fitting where we're going to enter that equipment, and then you have your service equipment. Now, just think if that weatherproofing, just because of the location, you think about any water it's going to hit, it's going to be flowing down. So we have to be thinking about all of our fittings to make sure that A, they're listed fittings, and B, they're installed appropriately, because one of those weak links can jeopardize the entire distribution system. We don't need water in our service equipment. And then you have your metal water pipes. This is your grounding electrode system. Remember, Article 250 talks about the grounding electrode system. I'm going to make sure that I employ the grounding electrode system all the way around and I keep everything connected. All right, protection of service entrance conductors. There's your service point, 230.50. You have to protect type SE cables where subject to physical damage. All of your cable supports. Then you have 230.43, raceways permitted for service entrance conductors. You can have rigid metal conduit, intermediate metal conduit. You can have rigid polyvinyl chloride conduit, PVC. You can have electrical metallic tubing, EMT, non-metallic tubing, ENT, flexible metal conduit, FMC, and then liquid type flexibles. Now, flexible metal conduit, LFMC. But there are rules and restrictions for each of those uses. So you have to understand what it is you're using, and then what are the specific, if there are restrictions, limitations for that application of that solution. Because remember, these are service conductors. They are unprotected. We treat them special. Pay attention to the details. That's my word. Word of the day. Pay attention to the details. 230.43. I know there's more than one word in that word of the day, but it's still a word of the day. I'm sticking to it. Service entrance conductors permitted to be installed in the following raceways. LFNC, high-density polyethylene conduit, non-metallic underground conduit with conductors, and then reinforced thermosetting resin conduit. Raceways permitted for service entrance conductors. Again, so you have these and you have those. So you have a whole list of what you can use. Pay attention to the details. 230.43, service entrance conductor raceways. Again, there's this is a kind of a nice diagram because it gives you all the different examples. All right, now we're getting into the service disconnect location. Now, one of the reasons why, if somebody did not want to call a conductor a service conductor, because the moment you call a conductor a service conductor, that disconnect is a service disconnect. Once you call that a service disconnect, you have to follow all the rules for the service disconnecting means. If you're only allowed 6, It could be one of the 6. Depends on whether or not there's an exception. It depends on whether or not you have to count that as one of the 6. For example, fire pumps don't count as one of the 6. There are other examples. So, but the details are that once you call it a service disconnect, you've got to follow the rules for that, and you'll have to have it in a location. You might have grouping requirements, and you might be limited on the number of service disconnects that you're required for that structure. So that's why in some cases they say, oh, that's not a service disconnect. I get it. I understand why. So all 1 and 2 family dwelling services are required to be provided a means of disconnect. And you're disconnecting from the utility. Okay. You'll notice in the 2023 code cycle, we put the emergency disconnect in for the firefighters and the first responders. So if your service is outside, you can accommodate that requirement by killing 2 birds with 1 stone, breaking 2 windows with 1 stone. The service disconnecting means has to be installed in a readily accessible location. It's permitted to be located outside the building or inside the building, and that's probably going to change in the 2026 code cycle, so be mindful of that. Follow the 2026 code. Panel 10 is making a requirement that the service disconnect be located on the outside for dwelling units. So if located inside the building, the disconnecting means has to be located at the nearest point of entrance. Because remember, when I bring service conductors into the structure and go to the service disconnecting means, those are unprotected conductors. I have to treat them special. So we limit the exposure inside the structure for that reason. Take a look at 230.70A1. Service conductors are considered outside the building. Now, okay, so because we have certain restrictions when they're inside the building, you have to understand what is considered outside the building, especially if you are going beneath the building. You might go under a building to serve, instead of going over top, you might decide to go under and serve another part of the structure. So when it's suitable raceway under not less than 2 inches of concrete beneath the building. So if you are outside of 2 inches in suitable raceway, then you're not considered in the building. You're considered outside the building. A building, but the raceway or cable is encased in not less than 2 inches of concrete or brick. So if it's encased, a vault, not typical for the dwelling units, conduit under not less than 18 inches of earth beneath the building, and then rigid metal conduit or intermediate metal conduit routed directly through an eave, not a wall. Okay, take a look at 230.6 again for that information. So here's a good image for your service disconnect locations. This is when you have on the left there, you have service equipment can be located outside of the building. And then on the right, you have your service equipment on the inside of the building. You'll notice that the grounding electrode conductor is connected to the inside of the building, goes through the structure, and it connects to the panel board that's on the inside. You might have a meter breaker outside and you have an inside feeder, or you have a meter outside feeding a panel board, which is your service entrance equipment, and it has your main overcurrent device. And remember, that panel board has to be at the nearest point of entrance. You're not going to enter the structure, take unprotected conductor through the structure to another side of the wall. You need to have it right there. And if you have to be on a different side of the building, then do all of your work to get to that side outside of the building. Whether you go up over top or down underneath, however you want to do it, just make sure you're outside the building. When you go to that point, when you enter the structure, you're at the nearest point. Another way to get it done, if you do a meter breaker and you do keep your service equipment on the outside of the structure, and now you're feeding a feeder into the structure, and you can go to any subpanel that you want. Here's a good example. There's your meter, and there's a main breaker. That's a service equipment on the outside. Really nice scenario. And I think that's basically what the panel 10 is moving us to in the future. Readily accessible service disconnecting means installed on the outside of the building. Now, in this case, you have a readily accessible service disconnecting means installed on the inside of the building. This is at the point of nearest, right? Because of the rules. So it's got to be the short nearest location, nearest point of entry. And then you have your service conductors down there on the bottom. So this is a bottom fed panel board. Those are your service conductors. Your grounding electrode conductor should be in there too as well. So all of that, and then all of your proper bonding. So this is going to be service equipment. That's going to be service equipment. And you're going to have your grounding and bonding done correctly based upon the listing of the product. So if it's use as only as service equipment, the grounding and bonding is going to be done for you. If it's suitable for use as service equipment, then you may have to make sure that you have the proper grounding and bonding inside. Then you have your service disconnecting location. Again, readily accessible location. Overcurrent devices restricted from being located in the following: easily ignitable material, on the steps or stairways, or in bathrooms. Service disconnecting means are not permitted to be installed in bathrooms in 230.70A2. So take a look at 240.24 as well. So that is ungood. This image here, you don't want a panel board. You don't want your service panel board inside of a bathroom. And moving forward, I think in the 2026 code cycle, they're going to basically make it such that you cannot put an overcurrent protective device in a bathroom. You can put the panel board in there, just can't put anything in it, right? So service disconnecting means is not permitted in bathrooms. And then you have to have, now, once you identify that this is a service disconnect, now you have to provide marking. And what are we doing with markings? We're adding transparency so that the electrical worker, when they open a piece of equipment and they see a disconnect that is marked service disconnect, they know when they turn it off, on one side is the utility, on the other side is the load. And that utility side is not, you're not turning that off unless you're calling the utility. That's why we have barrier requirements in Article 230, so that when you turn that overcurrent device, that service overcurrent device, to the off position, what's on the load side of it is off, is de-energized, and what's on the line side is barriered, but it's still energized. So very important. That marking of service disconnecting means is very important from a safety perspective. It's raising awareness. Right, 230.66. You have your suitable for use as service equipment. You have your suitable only for use as service equipment, and suitable for use as service equipment when not more than 6 mains are installed. Now, remember, in the 2023 code cycle, we prohibit in a panel board for you to have 6 disconnects in a panel board. But you may have existing equipment that is permitting 6 disconnects. So you got to be mindful. For a while, for a very long time, we're going to be dealing with both scenarios. There's they call it SUSI rated, suitable for use as service equipment, right? So that's how you have your label on your panel board enclosure, right? So you have to identify it as a service disconnect. And then that will be any equipment that will be either SUSI or suitable for use only as service equipment. There, look at that. That's real nice. So you have a nice identification for the service disconnect. It's on the enclosure. There's your service disconnect. That's a 200 amp service and all that jazz. Now, 230.85. Now, in the 2020 edition, we introduced the emergency disconnect requirement. That went in for first responders. Now, the language gives you options. You can put your service disconnect on the outside. If you do, you label it as your emergency disconnect. That is the disconnect that will kill power to the structure. Now, you'll also keep in mind that you may have to go to, you'll have to go back to the article for generators, but go back in chapter 4 for generators. there's an emergency disconnect that's a requirement there as well. We didn't have to put one in for photovoltaic because that has a rapid shutdown requirement in 690. We have a disconnect for energy storage systems. So go back for energy storage systems, you'll find a disconnect there. I believe in wind, you'll have an emergency disconnect as well. So you've got your wind as your source, your generator as your source, your photovoltaics as your source that has your rapid shutdown. You have energy storage systems, obviously your service. So, and then when you have multiple sources on site, you're going to provide an indication or a map or labeling to say where all of those other disconnects are. Put yourself in the shoes of a first responder. It doesn't have to be a firefighter. It could be a gas responding to a gas leak, whatever. They're going to need to kill power to the structure. Any first responder who has to kill power to the structure has to know how to do that. They're obviously going to look for the service. You may have a feeder. You may have the service out at the road or a feeder feeding the house. And we've got new requirements, I believe, in the 2023 code cycle to make sure that if your service is out at the road, that you still have a disconnect at the structure itself. You want to be able to kill power to that structure from the service, from a generator, an on-site generation. You have the rapid shutdown for the photovoltaic. Energy storage system needs to have a readily accessible disconnect, as well as your wind system. So just be mindful, all of your sources of power to a structure, we need to turn it off. We need to be able to think about the first responder getting into the structure. So 23085 is a very important part of the puzzle. So those are your different methods: emergency disconnect, not service equipment, emergency disconnect, service equipment, and then emergency disconnect, meter disconnect. So any one of these methods are appropriate and permitted to provide that emergency disconnect for the structure. All right, 23067 is surge. So you got to think, we're going to have surge requirements. So I believe it may have been new for the 2020 or the 17. I can't remember. I know in the 2023 code cycle, we put a 10 kA nominal discharge current rating requirement for that equipment. So in addition to all the different parts and pieces getting down to the structure, and you got to follow all the rules with regard to the distances, clearances, burials, it's all that good stuff. You get down to the service equipment, whether it's on the outside or the inside, and all of those rules. Now we're starting to talk about what, we haven't gotten to Article 250 with the grounding and bonding, but I'm bringing in my grounding electrode and my neutral, et cetera, but I'm going to have surge protection for if it's a dwelling unit. For that service equipment. That has since been expanded in the 2023 code cycle. So you're going to want to go back over to 23067. We also recognize the fact that the service could be out at the road in the 2023 code cycle. And we put the surge requirements in Article 225 and Article 215 for when you may not have the service serving the structure because the service is outside and it's not near the structure. The service is possibly down the road. We put a requirement in Article 225 and in 215 to get the surge as close to the structure as we can. That's another important detail on surge. Nominal discharge current rating, 10 kA, that's an important piece of the puzzle. That's not a short circuit current rating. That is the nominal discharge current rating. So anytime you look at a rating, always look at what the rating is about. Don't just make an assumption and go off half-cocked. We also have replacements. Anytime you replace the service, you're going to have to apply your surge protective device. The surge protective device can be a type 1 or type 2. Remember, type 1 can be used on the line side of the service disconnect or the load side. A type 2 can only be used on the load side of the service disconnecting means. Devil's in the details. Got to make sure you pay attention. Right? So there's your surge protective device. There's there's your grounding. And this is a nice picture because it shows the grounding electrode conductors connecting to making a grounding electrode system. You want to keep your conductor lengths, your lead lengths, as short as possible. In fact, if you could put this device right here and come straight across, that would be even better. Avoid bends and keep those conductors short. Remember that the longer the lead length, the more voltage you let through on a surge. If that conductor lead length is long enough, that surge protective device does nothing for you. So it's a very important critical piece of the puzzle. How short? Keeping those conductors short and straight. Integrating that surge right on the bus is your best solution that you could possibly do. This is a good picture. You got a surge protective device here. Now, remember, in the 2023 code, NEC 2023, this is required to be a 10 Ka IN, okay? And got to be mindful of that. Make sure that whatever surge protective device you're using, that you're picking the right one. You're noticing the barriers. There's your barriers. There's your barriers, and then here is your bonding. That's bonding your neutral and your grounds in the service entrance equipment. You'll notice that bar goes all the way across. This is your plug-on neutral. Okay, that's your plug-on neutral. That's for your ground fault circuit interrupters and your arc fault circuit interrupters. What else? Great image of all the parts and pieces that you need to think about. Look, there's the PON. That's the plug-on neutral. Tells you what to do with the bonding screws, etc. All right, now. Working space. I'm going to end on this one. So when you think about your service entrance equipment, you obviously have to have it in a readily accessible location. You have to think about whoever's going to work on that equipment after the fact. So when you have a electrical worker showing up, you need to give them proper ample space to do the work. So you'll have in Article 110, Section 110.26, the required working space is important to make sure that you have the space for the electrical worker, right? So there's some new requirements in the code that deal with open doors for proper egress to and from. And this applies generally to all equipment, not just service equipment. But you've got to think about it from a service perspective in any electrical distribution equipment, okay? So think about the electrical hazards of shock and arc flash. On service entrance equipment, unless I design things different, if it's really service entrance equipment, the incident energy in that piece of equipment is going to be high, simply because I don't have upstream overcurrent protection. So what do I do to mitigate risk? Risk is likelihood and severity. If I can't control severity, I have to control likelihood. How do I control likelihood? I'm putting barriers in place. I'm adding distance. Shock is another hazard. Barriers help me from shock. A barrier can help me prevent an arc flash event if I prevent or reduce the likelihood of somebody touching those energized parts. So all of these aspects are very important when it comes to service equipment. All right. That slide deck is available from IAEI. I would highly recommend you, and a book. So we have a book for 1 and 2 family dwelling units, and we have the appropriate slides for those applications. And in general, I mean, I know that's for 1 and 2 family, but the rules on service equipment for the most part, apply to service equipment, regardless of whether it's for a 1 and 2 family dwelling or a commercial or an industrial facility. Now, there are some additional requirements like surge that are only applicable to 1 and 2 family dwelling units, but still, great resource for you. Available from the IAEI. You can purchase that, download it. If you want an educational online or you want somebody to visit, please contact the IAEI through the website and request some details around educational materials and visit from technical experts who will help you answer the questions that you need answered and help you design things correctly for the National Electrical Code and for safety. Thanks again for taking the time today for this session on services. I hope you got something out of our time together. I appreciate you spending your lunch possibly, or maybe a little bit before lunch, or maybe a little bit after lunch, depending upon when you're watching this. This was a recorded session. Thank you for all you do for electrical safety. Thanks for what you do for the electrical industry. Please remember to be safe and please stay healthy. See you next week.